Hi everyone. So for this first part of the activity, I'd like to take a little bit of time to look back at activity number 6, part 1, that you completed during week 5 of the course last week. And some really interesting responses and questions came up in this activity that I think would be useful to address with the whole class. First of all, thanks for doing the activity. Everybody who did it received full credit, as long as you put answers. Some people didn't answer some questions, so they may have lost a point, but other words, you got credit for doing it. And I did write responses to a lot of you for specific questions. So if you haven't done so yet, go back into that activity and look at not only your grade, but also where I may have addressed questions or points that you had in your own specific work. But here, I'd like to just draw everyone's attention to some of the things that came up. About essay number 2, which is sort of an unusual essay because we're essentially writing 2 different letters to one person. And the first letter should be written from Kant's perspective, and the second letter should be written from your perspective. And so that's probably something unusual, not something you've done before, I imagine, for a paper. And so let me just tell you how you might format this. I think it's probably going to help if you think about these being 2 completely separate letters, which they should be, and you might even want to label them. You might want to say something like part 1, letter to Julie from Kant. Now, of course, you would have your name and the class title and stuff at the top of the paper, so we would know that even though it says Kant, we actually know it's coming from you. And then you would write that letter. And you should actually use a salutation as if you're writing a letter. And so forth. And so you would go ahead and write the letter. And your goal in that first part of the letter is to advise Julie as though you were Kant. And that's it. And so even though you have your own opinions and ideas, and maybe even you have your own interpretations of Kant that may not exactly be what Kant intends, you want to keep all of that out. You really just want to represent Kant in this first letter. And then by the time you wrap up that letter, you can turn to part 2, letter to Julie from whoever you are. Dear Julie, and this letter may say the opposite things that Kant said. It may say similar things that Kant said, but perhaps it has different ways of reasoning through it or different examples. You're different from Kant. Even if you find his ideas to be persuasive, you're going to have your own life experience that helps you come to the conclusion that you come to. And so this is the place where you can share those kinds of things, your ideas, your experiences, your advice with Julie. And so think about formatting it in 2 parts, and that may help you kind of organize for this essay. In terms of the length requirement, I don't think we put a word count on there. I had said that the paper should be, I think it was like 3 to 4 pages. I'm going to say about 1.5 pages each letter. That should do it. If you need to go over that or under that a little bit, that's fine. Some of you are more verbose in your writing, and some of you are very concise in your writing, and so play with that a little bit. I would say you can usually guess that if you're writing with Times New Roman, you're double spacing, you're usually going to get about 200 words per page, or close to that. So you might think about having maybe like 350 words, oops, sorry about that, 350 words per letter. And again, if you go over or under that by 50 or 100 words, I'm okay with that. I just don't want you to turn in something that's like only 2 pages, or I don't want you to turn in something that's, 12 pages long. Let's try to keep it as close to the mark as possible. Okay, so now looking more specifically at some of the things that came out of the number 6 activity from last week, I asked you to start off by looking at the table on pages 349 to 350 of the English Mercury Reader and identifying some rhetorical aims. What purpose do you think you're going to have as you sit down to write these letters? And a lot of you said things like explore, share, reflect. And then some of you said persuade. And so let me talk about this a little bit more. I think ultimately the goals for this essay are to convince and to persuade. But this piece, exploring, sharing, and reflecting, is very relevant. And so I'll tell you how it fits in. It may help you to know that there is a difference between convincing and persuading. And usually when we talk about convincing someone of something, we're talking about getting them to agree with you. So let's say I'm a heavy smoker and you don't think that's a good idea. You may provide me with all kinds of reasons and evidence and scenarios to try to convince me to stop smoking. And you might convince me. You might get me to say, you know what, you're right. Smoking is bad and I really should stop. Now, does that mean I'm actually going to do it? If I'm convinced, you've got me in terms of the ideas or the position. I agree with you, but it doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to act on those beliefs. Now, if you've persuaded me, that means I'm going to take it to the level of action. Not only have I come over to see what you're saying is true, I'm going to actually act accordingly. So right now, I'll give you a real situation. I have some colleagues and friends who are fighting for a cause, and they have convinced me that what they're fighting for is legitimate, but they've had a tough time persuading me to act on it, because sometimes it's easier to say that you agree with something than to actually take that next step and act on it. So with Julie, you have to ask yourself, okay, probably the first step is you want to convince her, right? You want to convince her to think what you think, right? But if you want her to act differently than how she's acting right now, that's persuasion. That's taking it to the next level. That's being convincing enough to cause her to want to act differently. So these should be the larger goals of your paper. However, you may use this as a strategy to get there. I know some of you said that your own experience has caused you to see this issue in a way where you can really relate to Julie and maybe you can help her see things differently. So if you want to do some exploring and sharing and reflecting as part of your effort to convince her to see things the way that you do, then that's fine. I think a lot of people don't like to use persuading as their goal because they feel like that means they have to be combative or argumentative. And so I just want to say that while your goal may be to convince her of something, that doesn't mean you have to do it in a harsh, combative kind of way. And so we'll talk about that when we get to this next point. So this was a comment that came up in the activity. I can't remember who wrote this, but this person said, I think the biggest challenge will be finding the right words of advice without seeming too pushy or that her life is being put on the spot from someone who is not involved. And I can certainly see why this is a concern. It's like we want to provide advice, but we don't want to come across as being jerky or judgmental or more moral than Julie is. And so how do we do that? The way to achieve this sort of balance, and this is a pretty good lesson just in life in general when we interact with people, and then also when we're writing papers, is to consider something called ethos. Rhetoricians talk about 3 different types of appeals: ethos, logos, and pathos. When you get to English 122, you'll spend a lot of time learning about these different appeals. They're very important to argumentation, but we're going to just look at them in brief here, and it may be something that some of you have already studied in the past, but ethos is really, it's a Greek word for character or credibility. And so if you want to look at this more, you can look at your English Mercury Reader on page 581. But basically, when we talk about a writer's ethos, we talk about how they come across on the page. Do they come across as someone who we trust, as someone who we respect, as someone who we're willing to take advice from? You know that it's not just what you say, it's how you say it. You've all heard that before, right? And politicians and rhetoricians have all figured this out, that the message is only part of the battle. If the reader or the audience doesn't like you, doesn't trust you, doesn't think you have goodwill, it really doesn't matter what you say. They're not going to perceive it very positively. And so how you present yourself in an argument is really important. And you see, I mean, it's almost a joke how far politicians go to convince us that they have upstanding ethos. They sort of a little over the top, and it's questionable sometimes as to how sincere they are. But here are some of the strategies that you can do to improve your ethos, and that may really help you not feel like you're being pushy with Julie or judgmental. So one thing you can do is you can concede to an opposing point of view, and this doesn't mean you're giving up the argument. It's a strategy to say, okay, does a person have a point here that I can concede to, where I can acknowledge something that's going to help them shut down their defenses a little bit? You can look at page 578 if you want to read more about this. But I know a lot of you wrote things in your activity like, you know, it must really be hard to be in a marriage where your partner cannot be intimate with you. That's really difficult. that's really a concession. That's where you say to Julie, that's hard, I understand, you know. Doesn't mean you agree with her. It doesn't mean you have to say that what she's doing is right. But those concessions can sometimes make your audience or your reader feel respected and appreciated and listened to. And in turn, they may be ready to listen to you and see what you have to say. The other thing you can do to bring your ethos up is to qualify your claim. And I'm not going to go into that in this screencast because I don't have time, but it's on page 579. And it just softens your claim a little bit so that it doesn't sound so combative or argumentative. And so you can look that up if you'd like to learn more. Pathos really has to do with, this is another appeal, one of the Greek appeals. And this has to do with connecting with your readers by emotion, or I'm sorry, I'm having trouble spelling and talking here. Connecting with your readers through their emotions or shared values. And so some of you talked about how you might share a story to relate to Julie. That's called an emotional appeal. That's an appeal to pathos. That's where you're trying to get her to, just as she's trying to get you to see the human side of her issue, you're going to try to get her to see the human side of your argument. Logos, that's very much Kant. Logos is really appealing to a reader's logic or a sense of reason. It can almost feel mathematical at times, and Kant is sort of a king of logic. So he's not terribly concerned with things like connecting with emotions. He's not terribly concerned with making his ethos or his character shine, but he is really invested in the logos, meaning the reasons, the equation behind the truth for why he feels the way he does. And so you want to think about how these things all fit into your argument as well. This next comment says, my biggest dilemma is, how do you write a letter of advice with an academic argument without inserting your own opinion? Or is this entirely different than an academic paper? I get very confused about what is and is not allowed in different types of paper, and this will be my biggest challenge. At least a few of you commented on keeping your opinions out, which gave me pause, because there's no way you can keep your opinions out of an argumentative paper. An argument is essentially your point of view. It's your perspective. It's your stance on something, right? So my question for those of you who are worried about opinions is, what do you mean exactly by opinions? If you mean having informed and supported claims or beliefs, that's a good thing. That's what you want to do in this paper. You should be able to offer points that somebody else might disagree with, but you should also be able to offer backing in the form of reasons and examples and stuff to make them stronger beliefs, not just gut opinions, but stronger beliefs. Now, if you mean judgmental attacks by opinions, you certainly don't want to do that. That's not going to help your ethos at all. So really think about what you mean by opinions and how opinions play a role in argumentation. Okay, this one, how do we keep the letters separate? This person commented on using Kant's ideas with modern vernacular, and that's exactly it. That's exactly what you're doing. We don't expect you to sound like Kant. We don't expect you to write like Kant. Just to maintain the spirit of Kant's ideas on the page, you don't need to finesse your writing so that you have some kind of old-timey tone or anything like that. Just really try to nail down his ideas. The last point I want to raise is this person says they're concerned that they're not going to be able to support their claims. Do they need to find research, articles, books? Do you need to have a works cited page or references? How does this fit into letter writing format? Great question. Research is not an expectation for this essay. We are hoping that you can support your ideas with just logic, reasoning, and maybe some appeal to pathos, which is like, examples or stories or observations. Think about this. Kant doesn't actually bring in research. He just tries to convince us by saying what makes sense, what sounds reasonable, and so forth. And that's what we want you to do in your letter as well. We're going to have plenty of time to do research in Unit 3, where we do pull some outside sources into our paper, but we don't expect you to do that yet in this essay. So no need to have research in here. If you want to hop on the internet and find some statistics about marriage or cheating or something like that, you're welcome to do that. But you're not required to do that. You're not required to have a works cited page or anything like that for this essay. If you have other questions or things you want to address, feel free to let me know. Thanks.